Hi everyone, my name is Mikaela Filson, and this is my presentation on syllabus design, ways to package language so it can be taught. Next slide. So before we start talking about syllabus design, we should have a common understanding of what is a syllabus. So in a practical sense, it describes what will be taught in a course. It's the actual plan for a course. And as Robinson describes, the syllabus has the units of classroom activity and the sequence in which they should be presented or performed. And that's true of any content class syllabus. But we know that language is different. And so language is not something that is inherently something to be learned in a classroom. It's more of a tool or a skill that humans use to express themselves, to communicate, to construct knowledge, and so on. And so when we talk about syllabus design specifically for language, we have to also consider the theoretical sense. And so specifically for a language class, a syllabus is really a way to conceptualize what language is and how it's learned so that materials can be selected or prepared for the classroom and for language learning. And as Graves said, to turn language into something that can be learned in a classroom, we need ways to define and package it so it can be taught. And the different ways that language has been packaged emerge as different types of syllabi. Next slide. And so this quote from Richards says, different approaches to syllabus design reflect different understandings of the nature of language and different views as to what the essential building blocks of language proficiency are. And so this idea of these fundamentally different beliefs on what language is and how it can be taught and learned, that can sometimes cause some difficulty within our departments because a teacher that believes that language can be learned as little building blocks from the bottom up through practice and memorization and repetition is going to structure and design her syllabus and her course in a completely different way than someone who doesn't have that same belief about language. And so these differences in beliefs about how language is learned can cause some difficulties with horizontal and vertical alignment and overall program articulation. Next slide. And so this quote by Robinson, I think is really important. The issue at the heart of language syllabus design comes down to, is the L2 best learned explicitly by understanding and practicing a series of formal units of language, however characterized, or is it best learned incidentally from exposure to the L2 during communicative events and tasks? And so the answer to this question, this how is the L2 best learned, the answer to this question basically is going to determine your syllabus design, the units of classroom activity and the order in which they're presented in a course. And this quote, it really presents this question as a dichotomy, right? Explicitly kind of relates to that synthetic syllabi, the grammatical, very form-focused syllabus. And the incidental exposure represents more of the analytic syllabi, the very meaning-focused. But in reality, we really have a continuum, right? And so teachers' beliefs and therefore their syllabus designs might fall anywhere along this continuum between form-focused and meaning-focused. Next slide. And so in world language curriculum and course designs, it's really been grammar driven traditionally. Why is that? Well, grammar topics, they do present a neat and orderly march through the curriculum where right and wrong answers are easily defined, which provides this comfortable and predictable structure that can be repeated year after year with different groups of students. Also, most textbooks rely on grammar for their design. And so if a teacher is using a textbook, they're likely following a grammar-driven approach or a grammatical syllabus. And textbooks do make our lives easier as teachers. And so a lot of teachers are hesitant to switch textbooks or get rid of a textbook altogether, because then we don't have to create all of our own materials. We don't have to spend as much time lesson planning necessarily, because you have the textbook as that guide. Again, it's comfortable, familiar, there's a stable structure. And the last point really relates to the apprenticeship of observation idea, and how in our own language learning experience, most likely this grammatical syllabus is what we experienced in our language learning. And maybe even in our student teaching placement, our cooperating teacher taught this way. And so it's really difficult to conceptualize a different way of designing a course or a different way of teaching a language if we've never seen a model for how that's done. Next slide. But the grammatical syllabus has been criticized. And so I think the field in general is moving away from the grammatical syllabus. And it's been criticized because with this approach, students are learning more about the language and its systems, and not as much how to use the language to express themselves, to construct knowledge, to communicate, and so on. And really, as language teachers, most of us are grammar nerds, and we enjoy studying the grammar of the language. But in reality, for most of our learners, they really don't enjoy that as much as we do. And so this approach can come off boring or not engaging to our students. And more than that, it's also proven to be ineffective in actually developing communicative competence or real proficiency. And we know that from the number of people we've heard who said they didn't really have any real proficiency until they had an immersive experience, a study abroad or something like that. And so the combination of the boring and the ineffective leads to poor retention in our language programs. If our students are bored and they're also not feeling successful or seeing progress, they don't tend to want to continue studying the language. And so I keep going back to this metaphor of language learning more like a life skill than like a content or an object to be studied. So it's more like learning how to drive or how to swim or how to play an instrument. And so if you're learning how to drive and you spend all of your driver's ed classes just talking about driving and learning the rules, but you never or hardly ever actually drive the car, you're probably not going to develop very good driving skills. And so that's kind of the argument for moving away from the grammatical approach. Next slide. So then if we don't organize our syllabus by grammatical concepts, if we're arguing to move away from that, how else can we package language so that it can be taught and learned? And I want you to add in the chat now, what other syllabus types have you heard of or used yourself, maybe other ideas for organizing a language course besides by grammar topic? And I know you guys have a lot more knowledge on this than maybe another language teacher who's not in a program like this. Good. I'm seeing like a thematic approach by theme. Okay. I'll have you move to the next slide so I don't run out of time. So I just decided to highlight a few alternative syllabus types here on this slide. So I have the thematic. You can organize your units and your syllabus and your course by theme, by task, by genre or text type, and by content-based instructional units. And I really like this quote by Lord. I think it's important to remember that you don't need to pick just one of these organizing principles. you can opt for different types of units to create your course, as long as it's aligned with your program mission and your beliefs about language teaching. And so this is where I want to bring in a little bit of my own experience. So over the past couple of years, as I've tried to move away from my very grammar-driven textbook and create courses for my Spanish 2 and 3, I've tried to combine different types of units and sequence them in a logical way to create a course. And so I try to draw on my students' interests for thematic units. So far I have sports, art, music, and food units. And so within those thematic units, I'm always making cross-cultural comparisons with students' interests and the target cultures. I also created a genre-based unit, which Bruno will recognize this example. And the point behind that one was to give my students the skills to interact with the target culture on their own through online texts, in this case, the travel blog post genre, so that they can continue learning language and culture on their own after leaving my class. And so the rest of this presentation, you can move to the next slide. I don't know if there we go. And again, thank you. I'm going to talk about the genre-based approach specifically, and I'm going to reference this unit that I created. And so this is just one idea for a different way to organize your syllabus. So genres, if you haven't taken the literacy course, are relatively stable types of utterances and texts with recognizable patterns used to achieve communicative purposes. A genre-based approach develops students' literacies by drawing attention to the specific communicative goals of the text and how the text achieves those goals. So you're studying the language that's used and how that language accomplishes different purposes in different contexts. And so in the genre-based approach, context is really important, and adjusting what language you use depending on what context you're in and who your audience is really important. And so this quote by Troyan states that genre-based pedagogies, because of their focus on how language functions to make meaning in spoken and written texts within a particular cultural context, provide a powerful tool for realizing the goals for world language instruction articulated in the World Readiness Standards for Language Learning, and for expanding existing understanding of language proficiency. So now, if you want to type in the chat again, I want you to think what genres in your context would be useful for your students to be exposed to. What genres do you think they would want or need to be able to interpret and or produce in order to use the language in communities they want to join? Think about the accessibility of that genre, the relevance to your students, and their interest as well. Yeah, so think about your specific context and what your learners, what genres might be important for them to be able to interpret. And you can move to the next slide. So once you've identified a genre that you think would be accessible and important for your students, you're going to go about selecting texts and other materials. And it's important to remember that they should be accessible, but not necessarily 100% comprehensible. The point is to develop students' abilities to understand a text through inference, inferring meaning without knowing every single word. And this is an important skill for our students to learn so that they can be more autonomous learners, so they can use the language on their own without us there helping them. And so as you are introducing the genre in the text. Make sure you're capitalizing on your students' prior experiences, activating their existing schemata and building on that. You're designing units, assignments, and activities that engage students directly in purposeful encounters with authentic genres. And so one suggestion that I came up with as I was creating this unit is possibly in upper level courses, maybe like level 3 or 4 before they get to an AP class, you can start introducing genres that show up on that AP exam. So I have a list here of the task models that are on the AP exam. Now these are really broad categories, so you would have to pick more specific genres within these categories, but you could create units to introduce these genres before they even get to their AP class. So that's just a quick idea. Next slide. This is the teaching learning cycle for a genre-based approach. And so we start with context setting. So in this step, we're talking with our students, discussing with our students, what is the purpose of this genre? Who is the audience? Is there specific content or genre knowledge the students need to know? So for the travel blog post, you're discussing why do people write them? Who are they for? Also, how does this genre connect to other genres in that category, right? So for travel blog, we have, I don't know, travel advertisements or official tourism websites or Instagram travel posts. So how does your genre connect? Next, we have the deconstruction stage. So this is a really important stage that I found when I was creating my unit. So you go through and you talk about the structure of the text. What are some of the usual features? What language is used? So what tenses? You discuss word choice, register. And this can be discussed in terms of field, tenor, and mode. So field is what is the text about, the content. Tenor is the relationship between the author and the audience. Is it more formal or informal? Is there more or less distance between the author and the audience? And then mode is how is the text constructed? So you're looking at the actual structure and other features of the genre. And even if you think like a genre is too complex for your learners, this step really helps break it down into its most important features, and it's essentially scaffolding comprehension and later production. After that, you have joint construction. This is a collaborative writing. So you're incorporating the structure, the features, the language that you identified in the deconstruction stage. And it's important to remind your students that there's variation in genres too. It's not like a rigid structure or formulaic construction. And some genres have more variation than others. So you're helping students explore the various choices and their effects rather than learning a single set of conventions. After that, they can go into independent construction where they produce texts in the genre and they wrestle with those choices and variation and trying to accomplish their purpose. And the teacher guides and provides feedback as needed. And then finally, there's the sharing and connecting stage. So writers link and compare their emergent texts with other texts in the genre. And as the teacher, you help them notice gaps between their text and genre samples, and you promote metacognitive reflection as well. And so this quote on the left-hand side is really important to the genre-based approach. You're cultivating a culture of discovery and analysis rather than simple replication in order to develop students who explore ideas and literacies rather than seek simple answers. Next slide. So no matter what syllabus design you land on, or if you're going to combine different units of different approaches to create your course, your syllabus design, always keep in mind the most important thing as you're planning, ask yourself consistently, is this unit communicatively purposeful, culturally focused, intrinsically interesting, cognitively engaging, and standards-based? And that will keep your goals in mind. And RITS does suggest collaborative planning within the departments. So if that's possible too, then you can design your syllabi and therefore your full department curriculum collaboratively as well. Next slide. I think I finished at a good point for us to have time for questions or input.
Yeah, I do have a question, Mikaela. So you mentioned the travel blogs that you've done, and I'm just curious about more of your experience. What else have you incorporated into your syllabus?
Yeah, so it's been a long process over the last couple of years trying to redesign my Spanish 2 and 3 courses. So my Spanish 2, like I said before, I have 4 thematic units now that I've developed. So I have 2 in the fall semester and 2 in the spring semester. I also do some story-based units. So I do some storytelling where I guess that's more focused on like high frequency vocabulary through storytelling and reading. And then the genre-based project, or the genre-based unit that I created, I haven't actually implemented yet. So it's going to be in second semester of my 3 honors course. So I will let you know how that goes.
Cool, thank you.
That's great, Mikaela. Thank you for sharing all that. I think your presentation was great, and obviously I was very happy to see the project that you did in the literacy course, also having connections in other courses. So I really like that at the end you mentioned how important it would be to collaboratively create a syllabus so that, especially in a genre-based approach, of course, we don't want to necessarily teach students how to write one genre, but then from that genre expand so that they understand how to look for other genres and understand how they find those texts. But if you are able to work with other teachers in the program, it's great because then each course could focus on specific genres and you kind of build some sort of progression. Then the students are more prepared to look at different specific genres, but then that broader genre awareness is built across the curriculum. So of course that would be the ideal. So I really like how you ended your presentation on that note.
Yeah, I wish I had more time to talk about collaborative planning because I think that's kind of,
It's huge.
I think that would be really important. Like you said, this is sort of a totally different way to look at syllabus design. And so if everyone's not on board, it's kind of hard to have alignment vertically and horizontally if you're doing something that's kind of radically different than what everyone else is doing. So be more effective if everyone's on the same page.
Yeah, but I really like though that. Sorry, I cut you off, Amanda.
No, I was just saying that like so when you're doing collaborative planning, like what you were saying about knowing, for a student, when they've seen this done, when they understand that's how we're organizing this around genres. And when I encounter a new genre, here's a different genre, but we're going to go through it in kind of a similar way. So I sort of recognize how we're doing school, how we're doing the learning. And if you are organizing the course very, very differently, then they might be uncomfortable with like, where are we? What, how are we proceeding? What's next? But you can accumulate the skills.
And they become familiar with that teaching learning cycle. They're going to recognize the different steps and they're going to get, as students, better at doing those different steps as well, the more times they do it.
Yeah, maybe sometimes pointing at similarities, because sometimes if you call it, it's a genre-based approach, people might think, this is so different from what I do, but there are similarities too, right? So if they prepare students to write specific AP genre, for example, that's one way to call their attention to what is possible to be similar to what they already do. You just spread that across more courses. So I also really like that connection that you made. As a starting point, what are the AP that genres that students need to know, and then you draw from there, picking on the genre chain. So I think that was a really good point as well, Mikaela. And one last note that I'm going to add, because I know we have to move on, will be oral genres are also genres. So if teachers are like, but my students don't need to write that much. Well, but podcasts are a genre, and you can use the same deconstruction cycle to get at their production, right? So another way to sell it.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Thank you.
that element of how are you selling it, and if they're creating genres, and that can go on to be a way that you can publish those things that they create and share with other people and help you promote your program. But then also I know there are a lot of tests now that are more and more asking for you to master specific genres on those tests, or to the IB test more than the AP. But that's coming from the assessments now too. They need to be able to understand what a genre is and how a type of text would be different. So that's it. Yeah, it's it. But I just thought you give a really good, succinct overview of the syllabus design to genre and brought that together across these sort of disparate types of knowledge and from your own experience. So very good. Yeah.
Very good, Mikaela. Thank you. And just a suggestion in the future, if you want to give this presentation again, I don't know if Anna agrees with me, but I think they would benefit from seeing a little bit of the actual task that you created, the actual sequence. So you give examples of what questions you ask for each cycle, so they understand how that deconstruction can happen.
Yeah, if only I had like 45 minutes.
I know. Something like Actful, it's a longer presentation. Right. So just.
Yeah. Thank you for that feedback.
Yes. So, I mean, yeah, this is, you want to be more specific about exactly what it is that you created, but you could take this to a conference. I mean, that's what would make it, go from this to really what you should take to a regional conference or a state conference, is that those specifics about what you've done with your class, with your genres. So, yeah.
Thank you, everyone.